A study by the National Foundation for Educational Research excuse me, has found that 9 out of 10 schools are stepping in to provide some children with clothing and meals. So this goes beyond the buildings, but to the children themselves. Well, Jenna Julius is Research Director at NFER and co-author of the report, and I'm very pleased to say joins us now. Jenna, thank you for joining us. What have you found?
Good afternoon, Nihal, and thanks for having me. So I think our research really highlights that without urgent action now, the cost of living crisis is likely to have far-reaching and long-lasting impacts on pupils. And this draws on the fact that our findings highlight that cost of living pressures have had a really profound and concerning impact on the level of pupil need within school. That's not just in terms of number of pupils, but it's also the level of need. And when I talk about need, I'm talking about welfare and financial needs, but also mental health, well-being. So as part of our surveys of over 2,500 teachers and senior leaders in mainstream and special schools, over a quarter of senior leaders told us that over a quarter of their pupils were requiring additional support for their well-being. And the result of this has been that schools are providing unprecedented levels of support to their pupils. So you just touched on the fact that over 87% of schools report that they're providing uniforms and clothing to some of their pupils. Similarly, we see that over 90% of schools are providing support to their pupils for extracurricular activities. And these stats are really astounding. And it's not only the fact that schools are contending with these additional levels of needs, but also teachers are telling us that they're increasingly unsatisfied with the level of support that they're receiving from the agencies that they work with, so local authorities, mental health services. So less than a quarter of teachers told us that they were getting all the support they needed from children mental health services. So this highlights that cuts and resource pressures outside of schools are also impacting the level of kind of need that schools are having to kind of contend with.
So there's a cost of living crisis, electricity bills, gas bills going through the roof. People are having to make really difficult decisions. Adults are. Can you give me some practical examples, some anecdotal evidence that you've been told how this is impacting upon the children themselves?
So I think that's exactly right. And schools are on the front line. They're the ones who are having to deal with these pressures, whether or not they have the resources to do so. So some of the things that teachers and senior leaders told us in our survey included increased numbers of pupils coming into school hungry, pupils coming in without the necessary equipment. And the football analogy would be getting the kids on the pitch with their football boots on is just not happening, let alone then schools having the challenge of kind of meeting those needs that aren't being met elsewhere in the system.
What are the fears from educators themselves about the impact this is having on the children's ability to educate themselves?
So senior leaders are telling us that this is having a real impact on their setting. So we know there are a number of kind of challenges that schools are facing at the moment, such as attendance, behaviour, and senior leaders are telling us that cost of living impacts are only exacerbating those challenges. So for example, over 80% of the senior leaders who responded to our survey told us that cost of living challenges were exacerbating safeguarding concerns and incidents in their settings.
What is being done in terms of, well, I know what's being done by the teachers themselves and the schools have done, but in terms of, again, accessing services and getting support so that teachers are not having to bring food in themselves to give to kids. What's happening there, Jenna?
Well, I think that's exactly the problem, is schools are having to step in to fill those gaps, and that's where we need action. So in the short term, schools and families need additional support to help contend with cost of living pressures. But in the medium term, really, we need to be looking beyond the school gates at wider services around schools to make sure that that is not just sitting on schools, particularly where some of these pressures might be better met by other forms of support or by other more specialist services.
So there's the kind of practical aspects, which is food and clothing. But what about the mental health impact that is being reported on the children?
So, as I said, we know that with the pandemic, mental health has been an increasing challenge for schools. And what our research highlights is that the cost of living pressures have only exacerbated that. And I think going back to your kind of comment about the concrete, the key thing here is it's the same issue that there's not enough funding in the system. And ultimately, if we leave these issues and don't act now, we're going to have some really long-lasting, far-reaching challenges in our hands. And it's worth saying, in terms of all the impacts that we're seeing on schools, they're particularly affecting, as you might expect, the most disadvantaged schools. And when I talk about disadvantaged schools, I'm talking about schools with more pupils who are eligible for free school meals, and special schools who are seeing the worst of those impacts. And those are already the schools where we know that face the most challenging context, and we already know that there are big gaps in the outcomes of pupils from different backgrounds, and it's clear that cost of living pressures are only going to be exacerbating those gaps.
Did you get any sense from the people that you spoke to as co-author of the report, Jenna, that there were any sources of optimism?
So I think, as I said, schools are facing a whole range of challenges at the moment, from post-pandemic recovery to staffing challenges. I think what's really clear from our findings is that many schools are kind of going above and beyond, and that does give a lot of optimism, I think, for a very resilient sector. But what's clear is that we need to be giving more support to schools to help meet the needs of pupils in response to what they're having to contend with at the moment.
And in conclusion then, what are the recommendations from the report which could help to shape policy, which could help to alleviate some of the pressures that are on teachers, but most importantly, that are on the children themselves?
Yep, so in the short term, as I said, additional financial support, both for schools and for families, to help meet these kind of pressing needs. But in the medium term, we would also like to see a kind of look beyond the school gates at the wider systems around schools, to make sure that there's a kind of more longer term solution, as we know that kind of cost of living pressures are here with us to stay. So the Office for Budget Responsibility are predicting that living standards, as measured by disposable household income per person, are set to remain below pre-pandemic levels into the end of the decade. So really these issues are here with us to stay, and that's why we need both short and medium-term solutions to this. More broadly, one of the other things that we found from our research is that it's not just the most disadvantaged pupils in schools who are kind of seeing these impacts. So really a lot of the support that schools are giving pupils is going to pupils who wouldn't otherwise be considered to be disadvantaged. So the other thing that we'd like the government to do is to revisit how disadvantaged pupils are, kind of how you qualify for that support within schools, to make sure that support is going to all of the pupils who need it.
So that net has got much wider in terms of when a teacher is getting food and getting clothes for kids, is there any mechanism whereby they can claim back the money that they're spending, or is this coming out of their wages essentially, or is there a budget? Do schools have a pot of money that they can use for this?
So schools aren't getting explicit funding to provide this support. So what we're seeing from our research is that they're using a whole raft of different ways to kind of fund this. Some teachers and senior leaders are telling us they are spending this money from their own pockets. Others might be drawing on other parts of their budgets, but the fact is that the money just isn't there, and that's why we need that additional support now to help fill that gap.
Jenna, thank you for joining us. That's Jenna Julius, the Research Director at NFER and co-author of this report we've been talking about.